My mom sold my belongings during my dad's funeral to pamper her new stepkids, but since my dad left me his house in his will, she now has to either pay rent or move out. A few weeks ago, my dad passed away unexpectedly, leaving me completely shattered. He'd been my rock, my guide, and my safe place in a world that often felt overwhelming. His death hit harder than I could have ever imagined, and the days following his passing were a blur of grief and logistics. As his only child, I took on the responsibility of handling the funeral arrangements and sorting through his things. Most of my time was spent at his house, surrounded by memories that both comforted and broke me. My mom, who had remarried years ago, wasn't much help. She showed up to the funeral with her new husband and stepchildren, but her focus seemed to be on them, not me. At first, I told myself it was her way of coping, that maybe she was trying to distract herself by focusing on her new family, but deep down I knew better. My mom had moved on from my dad long before his death. Still, nothing could have prepared me for what she did next. While I was at my dad's funeral, mourning the man who had shaped my entire life, my mom took it upon herself to clean out my room at her house. I didn't even know it had happened until a few days later when I finally went back to grab some things I'd left behind. The moment I stepped inside, I felt like I'd been sucker punched. The shelves that had once been lined with books and trinkets were empty. My posters, the ones I'd painstakingly chosen and put up over the years, were gone. Even the closet was barren, save for a few stray hangers swinging limply on the rod. It was as if my existence had been wiped clean. But the real blow came when I noticed the absence of certain things that weren't just items but pieces of my history. The record player my dad had given me for my 16th birthday? Gone. The collection of vinyls we used to listen to on Sunday afternoons? Disappeared. The stack of books he read to me when I was little, the ones with the dog-eared pages and his notes scribbled in the margins? Nowhere to be found. My room didn't just look empty, it felt hollow, like a shell of what it once was. I confronted my mom immediately, unable to contain my shock and anger. What happened to my stuff? I demanded, my voice shaking. Where's my record player? My books? Everything. She barely looked up from her phone. Oh, that, she said, her tone so casual it made my skin crawl. We needed to make room for the kids. The kids? I repeated, the words catching in my throat. She was talking about her stepchildren, the ones she'd been bending over backward to please since she married their dad. Yes, she said, as though it were the most obvious thing in the world. They needed the space, and honestly, you don't even live here anymore. It's just stuff, anyway. My chest tightened. It's not just stuff, Mom. Where is it? She finally looked at me, an exasperated expression on her face. I sold it, she said with a shrug. They needed a few things, and we could use the extra money. I stared at her, struggling to process what I'd just heard. She hadn't just given away my belongings, she'd sold them. My record player, the books, the sentimental items that held memories of my dad, were all gone because her stepkids needed a few things. You sold the record player Dad gave me? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. She rolled her eyes. You're being dramatic. It's not like you ever used it anymore. The words cut deeper than I thought possible. This wasn't just about the things she'd sold, it was about what those things represented. My mom had taken my grief, my memories, and the last tangible pieces of my dad and traded them away without a second thought. It felt like she was erasing me from her life to make room for her new family. I wanted to scream, to cry, to demand that she fix it somehow. But all I could do was stand there, stunned into silence by the betrayal. In that moment, I realized something I'd been trying to deny for years. My mom didn't see me as a priority anymore. And maybe she hadn't for a long time. The betrayal from my mom was bad enough, but what happened next completely blindsided me. A few days after the funeral, I received a call from my dad's lawyer, asking me to come to his office to discuss the details of my father's will. I wasn't expecting much. My dad wasn't a wealthy man, though he was generous with what he had. I figured anything left behind would go toward covering his debts or final expenses, with maybe a few sentimental items set aside for me. When I arrived at the office, I sat nervously across from the lawyer, still raw from the grief of losing my dad. He offered his condolences before pulling out a stack of papers. Your father was very specific about his wishes, he said, sliding a folder toward me. He wanted to make sure you had a secure future. I nodded absently, scanning the pages, until a particular line stopped me cold. My dad had left his house to me. Entirely. My name was on the deed, and the house was now legally mine. I stared at the words, struggling to process what this meant. At first, I thought it was a symbolic gesture. My dad had always wanted to make sure I had a place that felt like home, so maybe this was his way of giving me that even after he was gone. But as the lawyer walked me through the paperwork, it became clear that this wasn't just about sentimentality. My dad had allowed my mom to stay in the house after their divorce, so I would have some stability growing up, but now that it was mine, I had full authority over what happened to it. The realization hit me like a freight train. My mom and her new husband had been living in a house they didn't legally own. For years, they'd acted like it was theirs, making decisions without consulting me or acknowledging that my dad still had control over it. And now, everything had shifted. When I finally told my mom about the will, her reaction was exactly what I should have expected. "That's ridiculous," she said, waving her hand dismissively, like the very idea was beneath her. "We've been living here for years. This is our home." I kept my tone calm, though my heart was racing. "It's not your home, Mom. Legally, the house belongs to me now." Her husband jumped in, his voice dripping with entitlement. "You can't just kick us out," he said, glaring at me. "Think about the kids. Where are they supposed to go?" The irony wasn't lost on me. This was the same man who stood by while my mom sold my belongings without a second thought. They'd shown zero consideration for me or my feelings, but now they wanted me to bend over backward for their sake. "I'm not kicking anyone out," I said, though I could feel my patience wearing thin. "But things are going to have to change. If you want to stay here, we're going to need to have a serious discussion about what that looks like." My mom's face darkened, and I could see the wheels turning in her head as she tried to come up with a way to manipulate the situation. "This isn't what your father would have wanted," she said finally, her voice trembling with feigned emotion. "He would have wanted us to stay here, as a family." The audacity of her words made me want to laugh. "You mean the father whose record player you sold while I was at his funerals?" I asked, my voice colder than I intended. That shut her up, at least for a moment. Her husband, however, wasn't done. "You're being selfish," he snapped. "We've built a life here. You can't just take that away." I looked at him, my anger barely contained. "I didn't take anything," I said firmly. "This was never yours to begin with." The conversation ended with them storming off, leaving me alone in the house that now felt simultaneously like a gift and a burden. I hadn't asked for this power, but now that I had it, I knew I needed to make a decision. This wasn't just about property, it was about setting boundaries and finally standing up for myself. The house was mine. The question was, what was I going to do about it? It didn't take long for the situation to escalate. From the moment I told my mom about the will, she and her husband acted as though it was some kind of clerical error, a mistake they could ignore until it went away. They continued living in the house like nothing had changed, rearranging furniture, redecorating, and talking about plans for renovations, as if they still had any claim to the place. Every day I spent there felt like walking through a powder keg, knowing a fight was inevitable. Thankfully, I wasn't alone in this battle. My uncle, my dad's brother, stepped in to help. Uncle Rob was the kind of man you wanted in your corner when things got messy, direct, no nonsense, and fiercely loyal to his family. He came over one evening, armed with copies of the will and the deed, and sat down with me at the kitchen table. "Listen," he said, laying out the documents. "This house is yours. Legally, they don't have a leg to stand on. But you need to draw a line in the sand, or they're going to keep walking all over you." With his guidance, I decided to deliver an ultimatum. It wasn't a decision I made lightly. I wasn't trying to be cruel, and I knew the fallout would be ugly. But my mom and her husband needed to understand that this wasn't their home anymore. They could either start paying rent or move out. The confrontation happened the following evening. I waited until the kids were out of the house. They didn't deserve to be caught in the middle of this mess. Sitting across from my mom and her husband in the living room, I tried to keep my tone calm and professional, even as my heart raced. "I've thought about this a lot," I began, clutching the edge of the armrest for support. "And I've made a decision. Since this house is legally mine, we need to set some ground rules. If you want to stay here, you'll need to start paying rent. If that's not something you're willing to do, then you'll need to find somewhere else to live." My mom's reaction was immediate and dramatic. She looked at me like I'd just slapped her. "Rent," she repeated, her voice rising with each syllable. "We're family. You can't charge family rent." I felt the anger bubbling beneath my skin, but I kept my voice steady. "You sold my belongings while I was at Dad's funeral," I said. "I'm not sure you get to pull the family card anymore." Her face turned red, but before she could respond, her husband jumped in. He was less composed than she was, his voice already raised. "This is outrageous. he shouted, standing up so quickly that his chair scraped against the floor. "We've built a home here. You can't just take that away." I met his gaze, refusing to back down. "This isn't your home," I said firmly. "It's mine. And you've had plenty of time to adjust to that." "You're trying to ruin us," he yelled, throwing his hands in the air. "Do you have any idea what this will do to the kids? They'll be devastated." His words struck a nerve, but not in the way he intended. I thought about my dad, about how much he'd sacrificed to give me a sense of stability, even after the divorce. And here was this man, trying to guilt me into giving up the very thing my dad had left me to protect. "I'm not trying to ruin anyone," I said, my voice sharper now. "But this isn't about you, or your kids. This is about me finally standing up for myself." The conversation went in circles after that, with my mom and her husband taking turns accusing me of being selfish, ungrateful, and too young to understand how family works. But I refused to budge. Every insult they threw at me only solidified my resolve. By the time I left the room, I was exhausted but resolute. Uncle Rob called later that night to check in. When I told him how it went, he laughed dryly. "They'll push back as much as they can," he said. "But you're doing the right thing. Don't let them guilt you into giving up what's yours." I hung up the phone feeling a mix of emotions, relief, frustration, and a lingering sadness for what our family had become. I didn't want to alienate my mom, but I couldn't keep letting her take advantage of me. This house was my last connection to my dad, and I wasn't going to let anyone take that away from me. Not even her. As expected, my mom didn't take the ultimatum well. She had never been the type to admit when she was wrong, and this situation was no different. Rather than trying to work things out, she doubled down on the manipulation, pulling every trick in the book to make me feel like the villain. Her favorite tactic was using her stepkids as pawns. "They don't deserve this," she said one night, her voice trembling as if she were about to cry. "They're just kids. What kind of person would throw children out on the street?" Her eyes welled up, and for a moment, I felt the familiar pang of guilt she always managed to stir in me. But I caught myself before it could take root. I wasn't unsympathetic to her stepkids. They hadn't asked to be caught up in this mess. They were just as much victims of their parents' entitlement as I was. But I wasn't about to let my mom use them as a weapon against me. "They're not the ones responsible for this situation," I said firmly. "You are. You made choices, and now you have to deal with the consequences." That response didn't sit well with her. Her expression hardened, and her tears dried up as quickly as they'd started. "You have no idea how hard this is on me," she snapped. "I've done everything I can to give them a stable life, and now you're tearing it all apart." Her accusation stung, but I stood my ground. "I'm not tearing anything apart," I said. "I'm protecting what's mine. This house was left to me for a reason, and I'm not going to let you guilt me into giving that up." The conversation spiraled from there. My mom shifted from guilt to anger, then back to guilt, trying every tactic she could think of to get me to back down. "Your father always had it out for me," she said at one point, her tone bitter. "Leaving you the house was his way of punishing me. He knew this would happen." That statement hit me like a slap. "Punishing you?" I repeated, barely able to contain my disbelief. "He left me the house because he wanted me to have something stable in my life, not because of you. Stop making this about yourself." She didn't respond to that directly, but the look on her face said enough. My refusal to play into her narrative infuriated her, and it became clear that this wasn't just about the house. It was about control. For years, I'd bent over backward trying to earn her approval, trying to be the kind of daughter she could be proud of. But now, for the first time, I was standing my ground, and she hated it. The guilt trips continued over the next few days, each one more exhausting than the last. She claimed I was tearing the family apart, that I was being selfish, that I didn't understand what it meant to be part of a real family. She even went as far as to suggest that my dad wouldn't have left me the house if he'd known how I'd use it. Through it all, I held firm. It wasn't easy. After years of letting her manipulate me, breaking that cycle felt like trying to unlearn a deeply ingrained reflex. But every time she tried to pull me back into her web, I reminded myself of what my dad would have wanted. He'd left me the house because he believed in me, because he trusted me to make the right decisions. I wasn't going to let her take that away from me. One night, after another exhausting argument, I sat alone in the living room, staring at the old family photos still hanging on the walls. It was hard to reconcile the woman in those pictures, the mom who used to tuck me in at night and cheer for me at school events, with the person she'd become. But as much as it hurt, I knew I couldn't let nostalgia cloud my judgment. This wasn't about love. It wasn't even about the house anymore. It was about control. and I wasn't going to let her control me any longer. Things came to a head one evening when my mom's husband decided he'd had enough of my stubbornness. I was in the hallway outside my room, trying to gather my thoughts after another exhausting day of guilt trips, when I heard him storm up behind me. His footsteps were heavy, and his voice was low and venomous. "You don't know who you're messing with," he hissed, his eyes narrowing as he cornered me against the wall. His body language was intimidating, his posture rigid with anger. "You think you can just take everything away from us? You're going to regret this." His words sent a shiver down my spine, but I refused to let him see how much he rattled me. Years of dealing with manipulative behavior from my mom had taught me not to engage when things escalated. Without a word, I slipped past him and locked myself in my room. My hands were trembling as I reached for my phone, dialing my uncle's number with shaky fingers. When I told Uncle Rob what had happened, he didn't hesitate. "That's it," he said firmly. "You're calling the police. This has gone too far." The thought of involving the authorities felt daunting, but I knew he was right. This wasn't just a family squabble anymore. It was harassment, plain and simple. The next morning, I filed a report at the local police station. The officers listened carefully as I explained what had happened, their expressions serious. When I mentioned my mom's husband's aggressive behavior and history of temper issues, they assured me that my concerns were valid. My mom, predictably, tried to downplay the whole incident. "You're overreacting," she said when I told her about the police report. "He was just upset. You don't need to drag the cops into this." I kept my tone calm, but my resolve was unshakable. "This isn't about me overreacting," I said. "This is about boundaries. If he can't respect mine, there will be consequences." The report had an immediate effect. The officers issued a formal warning to my mom's husband, making it clear that any further harassment would result in legal action. For the first time, I felt like I had some leverage, and the shift in power was palpable. But just when I thought I'd seen the worst of their behavior, another bombshell dropped. Around the same time, I got a call from a woman I didn't recognize. "Hi," she said, her voice cautious but firm. "My name is Sarah. I'm your mom's husband's ex-wife." The name rang a bell. I remembered hearing bits and pieces about her over the years, but I had no idea why she was calling me now. "What's this about?" I asked, unsure what to expect. "It's about the house," she said, her tone sharp with frustration. "He's been using it as an excuse to avoid paying child support." My confusion must have been obvious, because she quickly elaborated. Apparently, my mom's husband had claimed full custody of his kids during his divorce, arguing that they were living with him full-time in my house. This, in turn, had drastically reduced his child support payments to Sarah. "The truth is, they're only with him part-time, and I can't afford to keep fighting him in court," she explained. Her words left me stunned. Not only had my mom's husband been taking advantage of my house to evade his responsibilities, but he'd also been weaponizing his children to manipulate two families at once. After our conversation, I called the police again, providing them with the new information. They opened an investigation into his actions, and Sarah promised to provide any documentation they needed to back up her claims. The situation had officially spiraled into something much bigger than I'd anticipated, but for the first time, I felt like I was gaining the upper hand. My mom and her husband had spent weeks trying to paint me as the villain, but now their lies and manipulation were catching up with them. As exhausting as it was, I knew I had to see this through. This wasn't just about protecting my house, it was about standing up for myself and refusing to let them continue taking advantage of me. And now, with the law on my side and their secrets coming to light, I finally felt like I had a chance to reclaim the peace they had tried so hard to take from me. The fallout from my stepdad's actions was swift and devastating for him and my mom. The investigation into his child support evasion moved quickly once Sarah, his ex-wife, handed over evidence. She provided court documents, custody agreements, and records of the financial lies he'd been spinning for years. It didn't take long for the authorities to confirm that he'd been avoiding payments by falsely claiming full custody of his kids while they were under my roof for barely half the time. The harassment charge I'd filed against him only added fuel to the fire. His attempt to intimidate me had backfired spectacularly, turning what could have been a warning into a formal charge. Between the legal pressure and the growing stress of keeping his story straight, my stepdad began to unravel. His bravado disappeared, replaced by thinly veiled panic as his world came crashing down. My mom, on the other hand, refused to acknowledge her role in the mess. Instead, she blamed me for everything. "You've ruined everything," she said one evening during one of her rare calm moments. She sat across from me in the dining room, the The same table where I'd eaten meals as a kid, now surrounded by the hollow emptiness of a home in transition. "No," I replied, keeping my voice steady. "You and your husband ruined everything. I'm just cleaning up the mess." She flinched at my words but said nothing, her gaze fixed on the table. For a brief moment, I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. But then I remembered the record player, the books, and the years of manipulation, and whatever sympathy I might have had disappeared. As the walls closed in on them, it became clear that my ultimatum wasn't something they could afford to ignore. With my stepdad's financial lies exposed, his ability to pay anything, even rent, was non-existent. My mom scrambled to keep up appearances, suggesting we come to some kind of compromise. She proposed paying a reduced amount of rent until things settled down and repeatedly tried to guilt me into letting them stay. "It's just temporary," she said, her voice heavy with faux desperation. "You can't expect us to move right now. The kids." "I do expect you to move," I interrupted, my patience worn thin. "You've had weeks to figure this out, and I've been more than fair. Pay rent or leave. That's it." She glared at me, her face twisted with anger and disbelief. "You're just like your father," she spat, as if it were the worst insult she could muster. "Thanks," I replied flatly, refusing to let her bait me. The realization that they had no choice came slowly, but it came. Their options were limited, and with no way to afford the rent I'd asked for, they were forced to pack up and leave. Moving day was a strange experience. My mom and stepdad moved through the house like ghosts, their voices low and strained as they loaded boxes into their car. The Stepkids, who had always been polite despite the tension, avoided eye contact with me. I felt a pang of guilt for what they were going through, but I knew they weren't the ones at fault. As I stood on the porch, watching their car pull away, a flood of emotions washed over me. Relief that the chaos was finally ending. Sadness for the fractured family dynamic that could never be repaired. And anger, directed squarely at my mom for putting me in this position in the first place. This wasn't the resolution my mom wanted, but it was the only one that made sense. My stepdad's lies had caught up with him, and my mom had no choice but to face the consequences of her loyalty to a man who had done nothing but bring trouble into her life. As the sound of their car faded into the distance, I took a deep breath and stepped back inside. The house felt different. Quieter. Lighter. For the first time in months, I felt like it was mine again, not just legally, but emotionally. The chaos was over, and I finally had a chance to rebuild, to reclaim what my dad had left me, and to create a future that wasn't weighed down by the mistakes of others. The day they moved out was surreal. I stood in the driveway, arms crossed, watching as the last of their boxes were crammed into the trunk of their car. My mom refused to look at me, her face tense and distant as she barked instructions to the stepkids. My stepdad muttered under his breath the entire time, loud enough for me to catch words like ungrateful and heartless, but I stayed silent. I'd already said everything that needed saying. This moment wasn't about them anymore. It was about reclaiming what was mine. When they finally drove away, their car disappearing down the street, I turned back to the house, letting out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. For years, this place had been my sanctuary, filled with memories of my dad. But in the months since his death, it had become something else entirely, a battleground. Seeing it empty now, stripped of their presence, felt bittersweet. It wasn't just an empty house anymore. It was a blank slate, a chance to start over. The rooms inside felt hollow and quiet, but instead of being overwhelmed by the emptiness, I found it comforting. I walked through each room slowly, taking in the bare walls, the empty spaces where furniture had once been, and the faint echoes of the life that had been lived here. For the first time, in what felt like forever, I wasn't weighed down by the tension or the constant need to defend myself. This house was mine now, not just on paper, but emotionally. It was a space where I could finally begin to heal. With my Uncle Rob's help, I set out to restore it to its former glory. He arrived the next morning, tools in hand and a determined grin on his face. "Time to make this place yours again," he said, clapping me on the shoulder. Together, we started tackling the damage left behind. The scuffs on the walls, the holes from hastily removed picture frames, the lingering remnants of their presence, it all had to go. Repainting the walls was my first step. The mustard yellow paint in the kitchen, a color my mom had chosen without ever consulting anyone, was the first to be covered. I picked a soft gray instead, a calming color that reminded me of the mornings I used to spend with my dad, sipping coffee and planning our weekends. Uncle Rob and I spent hours scrubbing, painting, and patching up the little flaws that had accumulated over the years. Each stroke of the paintbrush felt like reclaiming a part of myself, like wiping away the chaos and replacing it with something peaceful and steady. Once the walls were done, we turned our attention to the furniture. Most of it had been taken when my mom and stepdad left, which meant starting from scratch. Uncle Rob introduced me to the joys of secondhand stores and thrift shops, where we hunted for pieces that felt like they belonged in the house. On one of those trips, I spotted it, a vintage record player sitting on a shelf, almost identical to the one my mom had sold. My heart skipped a beat as I ran my fingers over the wood paneling, memories of my dad flooding back in an instant. "This is it," I said quietly, my voice catching in my throat. Uncle Rob smiled. "Looks like it was waiting for you. Let's take it home." We placed the record player in the living room, setting it up in the corner where my dad's old one had once been. As I watched it spin for the first time, playing one of the vinyls I'd managed to hold onto, it felt like a piece of my dad had returned. Slowly but surely, the house began to feel like home again. The living room, once filled with tension and arguments, transformed into a cozy space with soft lighting and comfortable furniture. The bedroom I'd grown up in became a sanctuary, its walls painted a calming blue and adorned with photos that celebrated the life my dad and I had shared. Even the little things, like reorganizing the kitchen cabinets or planting flowers in the front yard, brought me a sense of peace. It wasn't just about making the house look nice. It was about reclaiming the space, about turning it back into a place of love and comfort. Each change I made, no matter how small, felt like a step forward. The wind chimes my dad had hung on the front porch years ago were still there, and one evening I stood beneath them, listening to the soft, familiar sound they made in the breeze. It reminded me that even though so much had changed, the core of what my dad had built here still remained. Reclaiming the house wasn't just about the physical work. It was about reclaiming myself, my sense of stability, and the memories my mom and her husband had tried so hard to erase. This house was my foundation, and now, with every repair, every coat of paint, and every piece of carefully chosen furniture, it was becoming something more. It was becoming a reflection of the life I was rebuilding, a life that was finally fully mine. In the months that followed their departure, the house settled into a peaceful quiet I hadn't realized I was craving. Gone were the tense conversations, the guilt-laden sighs, and the sharp-edged remarks from my mom and her husband. The air felt lighter, the space brighter. But the scars they'd left behind, emotional more than physical, weren't so easily erased. My relationship with my mom, already fragile, had become a tenuous thread stretched thin by everything that had happened. At first, she kept her distance, likely nursing her bruised pride after being forced to leave. But it didn't take long before she began reaching out again. Her messages alternated between half-hearted apologies and thinly veiled accusations. "I didn't want things to end up this way," she texted me once. "But you've become so cold. I don't even recognize you anymore." On another occasion, she called and launched into a tirade, accusing me of destroying our family and turning your back on the only mother you'll ever have. I listened to her words, feeling the familiar pangs of guilt creep in, but they no longer had the same power over me. For the first time in my life, I felt like I had control, not just over the house, but over my own boundaries. I'd spent years bending to her will, desperate for her approval, only to realize that her version of love was transactional. It was freeing to let go of the need to prove myself to her. Keeping my distance wasn't easy. There were moments when I missed the good parts of our relationship, the rare times when she'd been warm and supportive. But those memories were outweighed by the years of manipulation and the months of chaos after my dad's death. Every time I felt tempted to reach out, I reminded myself of the way she'd sold my belongings, tried to guilt me into giving up the house, and turned her husband's anger into my problem. Meanwhile, life in the house began to take shape in a way that felt entirely my own. The once empty rooms were now filled with furniture I'd chosen, colors I loved, and pieces that reminded me of my dad. The record player I'd found became a constant companion, filling the space with the music he'd loved so much. On weekends, I'd sit by the window with a cup of coffee, letting the warmth of the sunlight and the familiarity of old songs remind me of him. Uncle Rob visited often, his presence a grounding force as I navigated this new chapter. "You've done good, kid," he said one afternoon as he helped me hang a photo collage in the hallway. It was a collection of snapshots from my childhood, pictures of me and my dad fishing, hiking, and laughing together. "Your dad would be proud of you." His words meant everything to me. They were a reminder that even though I'd lost so much, I'd also gained something invaluable, a sense of self-worth and the ability to stand up for what mattered to me. As for my mom and her husband, their lives seemed to spiral further after leaving the house. The legal trouble from his child support evasion hadn't disappeared, and Sarah, their target for years, was finally seeing justice served. My mom hinted at their struggles during one of her calls, but I didn't engage. It wasn't my burden to bear anymore. Through it all, I focused on moving forward. The house became more than just a physical space. It became a symbol of everything I'd fought for and everything I was reclaiming. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was rebuilding. The aftermath of the chaos they'd brought into my life wasn't easy to navigate, but for the first time, I felt like I was steering my own ship, free from the storms they'd tried to trap me in. Living in the house my dad left me has been a healing experience in ways I didn't anticipate. At first, I thought it would feel lonely being in this big, empty house with just my memories for company. But as time passed, the space started to transform, not just physically with all the changes I'd made, but emotionally too. It wasn't just a house anymore. It was a sanctuary, a reminder of the love and stability my dad gave me, even in death. Every room told a story, not of loss, but of resilience and the enduring bond one shared with him. I'd wake up in the mornings to sunlight streaming through the windows, the same ones my dad and I used to sit by as we planned our weekend hikes. The house was quiet now, but it was a peaceful quiet, not the oppressive silence that had hung over it during the chaos with my mom and her husband. On weekends, I'd put on a record, one of the old classics my dad loved, and let the music fill the space, weaving the past and present together in a way that felt grounding. Rebuilding my life within these walls wasn't just about the house. It was about the people I let into it. I started inviting friends over for dinners and game nights, slowly filling the rooms with laughter and warmth again. It wasn't long before the house became a hub for the people who truly cared about me, friends who stood by me during the fallout with my mom, family members like Uncle Rob who never wavered in their support, and even a few new faces I met along the way. Through it all, I kept a few of my dad's traditions alive. Sunday mornings were for pancakes and jazz, just like they'd always been. The garden he loved so much got a refresh, with new flowers and a few of his favorite plants. Working in the soil felt like a connection to him, a way to honor his memory while creating something new. But the most surprising part of this new beginning was the sense of independence I found. For years, I'd measured my worth by how well I could meet other people's expectations, especially my mom's. Now, for the first time, I was living life on my own terms. The decisions I made, the people I surrounded myself with, and the dreams I pursued were entirely mine. Of course, it wasn't all smooth sailing. There were moments when the weight of everything still pressed on me, days when I missed my dad so much it hurt, or when the lingering echoes of my mom's manipulation tried to creep back in. But those moments didn't define me anymore. Instead of dwelling on the pain, I reminded myself of how far I'd come. As the months went by, the house evolved into something entirely new. It wasn't just a reminder of the past, it was a foundation for the future I was building. I started taking small risks, stepping out of my comfort zone in ways that felt exhilarating. I picked up new hobbies like photography and painting and even started volunteering at a local community center, a way to give back and stay connected to something bigger than myself. Living here, surrounded by memories of my dad and the life he'd built, felt like carrying his legacy forward. His love and guidance shaped the person I was becoming, and every decision I made felt like a tribute to his belief in me. This house, once a battleground, had become a place of healing and growth, a space where I could finally breathe, dream, and live authentically. The person I was when I first walked back into this house after the funeral felt like a distant memory. I wasn't that scared, unsure version of myself anymore. I'd fought for this life, for this peace, and I wasn't going to let anyone take it away from me again. My dad had given me more than just a house. He'd given me the tools to rebuild, to stand tall, and to start over. And now I was finally doing just that.